The hallway was silent, except for the sound of expensive heels. Clicking against marble, James Whitmore stood at attention outside the king's private gallery. His uniform pressed sharp, his face a mask of discipline. 23 years he'd served the royal family. 23 years of standing where he was told, moving when commanded, speaking only when spoken to. But today would be different. He heard them, before he saw them. Voices, urgent whispers echoing through the corridor. Then she appeared, the Duchess, flanked by 2 assistants and the palace decorator. A thin man named Gerald who always looked nervous. "Good morning, ma'am," James said, his voice steady. She barely glanced at him. Her eyes were fixed on the double doors behind him, the ones that led to the private gallery. The room where Diana's portraits had hung for years, untouched, sacred. "Open the doors, please," she said. Not unkindly, but with the confidence of someone who expected immediate obedience. James didn't move. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing. We share powerful, true stories that deserve to be heard. The decorator stepped forward, fumbling with a measuring tape. "We'll need at least 2 hours to complete the transition, ma'am. The new portraits arrived this morning. They're exquisite, really." "Varied the doors," she repeated, this time looking directly at James. His throat felt dry. His hand should have been reaching for the handle. That's what 23 years of training told him to do. But his fingers stayed at his side. "I'm afraid I cannot do that, ma'am." The hallway seemed to freeze. One of the assistants gasped quietly. The decorator's face went pale. The Duchess tilted her head slightly, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "I'm sorry. The gallery is not to be disturbed today, ma'am. I have my orders." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or anger, carefully controlled. "Orders," she said slowly. "From whom?" James felt his heart hammering, but his voice didn't waver. "From the Prince of Wales, ma'am?" Another silence. Longer this time. The kind of silence that feels heavy, that presses down on your chest. She took a step closer. Close enough that James could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive. Close enough that he could see the tightness around her mouth. "The prince and I discussed this matter yesterday evening," she said quietly. "He approved the changes. So either you're mistaken or you're lying." James had faced many things in his years of service. Protesters, threats, long nights standing in freezing rain. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. For the choice between duty and disobedience. For the weight of loyalty when it's pulled in 2 directions. "I received my instructions this morning, ma'am," he said, directly from His Royal Highness. "The portraits are to remain exactly as they are." The decorator made a small noise, something between a cough and a whimper. The assistants exchanged glances. The Duchess stared at James for a long moment. Then she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "I see," she said softly. "Well then, we'll just have to sort this out, won't we?" She turned and walked back down the hallway, her heels clicking sharp and fast against the marble. The decorator and assistants hurried after her, throwing nervous looks back at James, and James stood alone in the empty corridor, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career or the most important stand of his life. Asterisk, 10 minutes passed. Then 20 DOT. James remained at his post, but his mind was racing. Had the prince really given those orders? Yes. This morning, just after dawn. James had been surprised to see him awake so early, standing near the gallery doors with a look on his face that James had never quite seen before. Sadness, maybe. Or guilt. "No one enters today, Whitmore," the prince had said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't slept. "No matter who asks. No matter what they say. The portraits stay." "Yes, sir," James had replied. The prince had paused, his hand on James's shoulder. "I know what's been planned. I know she wants them removed. But not today. Not yet." And then he'd walked away, his footsteps echoing like ghosts through the empty palace. Now, James heard different footsteps approaching. Faster, multiple people. He straightened his posture, preparing himself. The Duchess returned. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her walked Robert Pemberton, the palace chief of staff, a man who'd served 3 monarchs and had the personality of cold steel. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. "Mr. Whitmore," Pemberton said. His voice was clipped, professional. "There seems to be some confusion about today's arrangements." "No confusion, sir," James replied. "I have direct orders from His Royal Highness." Pemberton's jaw tightened. "The prince spoke with me last evening. He agreed that the gallery would be redecorated. The Duchess has planned this for weeks. Surely you understand that your orders are outdated." "My orders were given this morning, sir." At 6:15, something passed across Pemberton's face. Recognition, perhaps. Or understanding. The Duchess stepped forward. Her composure was perfect, but James could see the tension in her shoulders. "This is becoming absurd. Those portraits should have been removed months ago. The past needs to make room for the present. For the future?" "I understand, ma'am," James said. And he did. He understood more than she knew. He understood that this wasn't about paintings or decoration or moving forward. This was about memory, about guilt, about a ghost that lived in every corner of this palace, whether anyone admitted it or not. "But my orders stand," he continued. "I cannot let anyone enter the gallery today." The Duchess's mask cracked, just slightly. "She's been gone for years," she said, and her voice was quieter now, almost vulnerable. "How long must we all live in her shadow? How long must I?" She stopped herself, took a breath. When she spoke again, her voice was controlled. "I am asking you to step aside." "I cannot, ma'am." Pemberton intervened. "Whitmore, you're putting yourself in an impossible position. If you refuse a direct request from the Duchess, there will be consequences. Serious consequences." James had thought about this during those 20 minutes of waiting. He'd thought about his pension, his career, his reputation. He'd thought about his wife, who worried about him constantly. His daughter, who was so proud when she told people her father served the royal family. But he'd also thought about that morning 3 years ago, when Diana's death was announced. He'd been standing in this same hallway. He'd watched the prince walk into that gallery and stay there for hours, alone with those portraits, weeping like James had never heard a man weep before. "I understand the consequences, sir," James said. The Duchess turned away, her hands trembling slightly. She pressed them together, composing herself. "Call him," she said to Pemberton. "Call the prince. Right now. Let's settle this once and for all." Pemberton pulled out. His phone dialed. They all waited. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. Too quiet for James to hear the words, but he could hear the tone. Pemberton's expression shifted. He listened for a long moment, said yes, sir, twice, and then ended the call. He looked at the Duchess. Then at James. "The guard's orders are confirmed. The gallery remains closed. The portraits remain in place." The Duchess's face went pale. "But he promised he's changed his mind, ma'am." For a moment, James thought she might cry. Her eyes were bright, her breathing unsteady. But she didn't. She simply turned and walked away, slower this time. Defeated. Pemberton lingered. He studied James with something that might have been respect, or might have been warning. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Whitmore," he said quietly. "I hope it was worth it." Then he too was gone, and James was alone again in the silence. The rest of the day passed in strange stillness. James remained at his post, as ordered. Staff members walked by occasionally, their eyes full of questions they didn't dare ask. Word had spread quickly through the palace. The guard who defied the Duchess. The portraits that wouldn't be moved. By evening, James's legs ached. His back was stiff. But he didn't move. At 7 o'clock, as the sun began to set, he heard footsteps again. Different ones this time. Slower, heavier. The prince appeared at the end of the hallway. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened, his jacket unbuttoned. There were shadows under his eyes that made him look older than his years. "Your Royal Highness," James said, standing even straighter despite his fatigue. The prince stopped a few feet away. For a long moment, he simply looked at James. Then he spoke. "You didn't have to do that, you know." "What you did today?" "I was following orders, sir." We both know it was more than that. The prince's voice was soft, almost sad. You could have let her in. You could have called me first, asked for clarification. You chose to stand your ground. Why? James hesitated. 23 years of training told him to stay silent, to keep his opinions to himself. But something in the prince's face, some desperate need for honesty, made him speak. Because grief doesn't follow a schedule, sir, James said quietly, and neither does guilt. The prince flinched as if he'd been struck. I was there that morning, James continued. When the news came, I saw you go into that gallery. I heard... He stopped, wondering if he'd already said too much. You heard me crying? The prince finished. His voice was barely a whisper. Yes, sir. The prince turned toward the gallery doors. His hand reached out, touching the wood gently, like he was touching something fragile. Do you know what the worst part is, Whitmore? The worst part isn't that she's gone. It's that I didn't. He paused, struggling with the words. I didn't love her the way she deserved. Not while she was here. Not when it mattered. James said nothing. There was nothing to say. And now everyone wants me to forget, the prince continued. Move on. Start fresh. Remove the reminders. But those portraits, they're all I have left of my guilt, of my mistakes, and I'm not ready to let them go. Maybe I'll never be ready. He turned back to James. His eyes were red. She called me this afternoon. My wife, she was crying, saying I humiliated her in front of the staff, that I chose a dead woman over her again. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Maybe she's right. With respect, sir, James said carefully, I don't think this is about choosing. I think it's about grief. And time. Everyone needs time. It's been years, Whitmore. Perhaps grief doesn't measure time the way we do, sir. The prince studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Thank you. For today, for understanding what I couldn't say. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. Handed it to James. What's this, sir? Tomorrow morning, you'll be reassigned. Palace administration will claim it's routine. We both know it's not. This card has my private number. If you ever need anything at all, you call. James's throat tightened. Sir, I don't need, please. The prince's voice cracked slightly. Let me do this one decent thing. After all, the indecent ones. James took the card, slipped it into his pocket. Thank you, sir. The prince nodded. Then he did something James never expected. He extended his hand. James shook it. The prince's grip was firm, but trembling. Good night, Whitmore. Good night, sir. Prince walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance, and James stood alone in the hallway, holding his post until his shift ended at midnight. The next morning, as predicted, he received his reassignment notice. He was being transferred to the outer grounds. Far from the palace interior. Far from the gallery. Far from the portraits that he'd fought to protect. His wife was relieved. It's better this way, she said. Safer, less complicated. But James felt something he hadn't expected. Loss. As if he'd been part of something important. Something that mattered, and now it was over. He reported to his new post without complaint. 3 months passed. Then 6. He heard rumors occasionally. The portraits were still there. The gallery remained mostly closed. The Duchess had redecorated 3 other rooms instead, throwing herself into projects with fierce determination, and the prince. The prince had grown quieter, more distant. Staff whispered that he spent long hours alone, that sometimes late at night he was seen near the gallery doors, just standing there, remembering asterisks 7 months after that day in the hallway. James received a phone call. It was late evening. He was at home, reading the newspaper while his wife knitted on the couch. The number was unknown, but something made him answer. Whitmore? The voice was familiar, strained. Double quotes. Yes, sir. James stood immediately, years of training kicking in. Need you to come to the palace, now, tonight. It was the prince, but he sounded different, broken. Sir, I'm not assigned to. I don't care about assignments. Please, I need. The prince's voice cracked. "I need someone who understands." 20 minutes later, James was driving through the palace gates. A staff member met him at the entrance, led him silently through corridors he hadn't walked in months. They stopped outside the gallery. The prince was there, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. His jacket was off, his shirt wrinkled. There was an empty glass beside him and the smell of whiskey in the air. He looked up when James approached. His eyes were devastated. "She's leaving," he said simply. James didn't need to ask who. "The Duchess. She gave me an ultimatum. The portraits go, or she does." The prince laughed bitterly. 7 months she's waited. 7 months of patience. And tonight, she finally said it. "Choose her memory or our marriage. You can't have both." He pulled himself to his feet, unsteady, walked to the gallery doors, and pressed his forehead against them. "The terrible thing is, Whitmore, I understand. I do. I understand what it's like to live with a ghost. To compete with a memory. I put her through that. The way I—" He stopped, breathing hard. "The way I loved someone else while married to Diana, and now it's happening again. Different ghost. Same pain." "What did you tell her, sir?" James asked quietly. "I told her I needed time. Just a little more time. But she's done waiting." He turned to face James. "She's packing now. She'll be gone by morning. And everyone will say it's my fault. That I'm obsessed. That I can't let go. Are they wrong, sir?" The prince's face crumpled. "No, they're not wrong. I can't let go. Because letting go means accepting that I failed her. That I spent years making her miserable. And then she died before I could make it right. Before I could apologize. Before I could." His voice broke completely. He slid back down the wall, covering his face with his hands. James had never seen anything like this. The Prince of Wales, future king, sitting on the floor, weeping like a lost child. Slowly, carefully, James sat down beside him. Not too close. Respectful distance. But present. "My father died when I was young," James said after a moment. "We'd had a fight the day before. Something stupid. I can't even remember what it was about. But I was angry, and the last thing I said to him was that I wished I had a different father." The prince looked up, his face wet with tears. "He had a heart attack the next day," James continued. "Died before the ambulance arrived. And I spent years carrying that guilt. Those last words, that anger, I couldn't let it go." How did you move past it?" "I didn't, not really." James looked at the gallery doors. "But eventually I realized something. Guilt is just love with nowhere to go. All that regret, all that pain, it's because we loved them. And we wanted to do better. Be better. But I wasn't better," the prince whispered. "I was terrible to her." "Yes, sir." "You were, but you're not the same man now. Grief changed you. Guilt changed you. The question isn't whether you can undo the past. You can't. The question is what you do with the man you've become." The prince was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice steadier. "She deserves better. My wife, she deserves a husband who's present. Who's here, not lost in memory and regret." "Yes, sir." "She does. But I don't know how to be that man while those portraits are still there. While I'm still standing guard over my own guilt." James chose his next words carefully. "Perhaps, sir, the portraits aren't the problem. Perhaps the problem is that you're trying to protect guilt instead of processing it. Holding on to it instead of learning from it." The prince looked at him sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that keeping those portraits isn't about honoring Diana, sir. It's about punishing yourself. And punishment doesn't lead to healing. It just leads to more pain. For you, for your wife, for everyone." The words hung in the air between them. Truth, uncomfortable, and sharp. The prince stood slowly. He walked to the gallery doors and placed both hands on them. For a moment, James thought he might open them. But he didn't. "If I remove them," the prince said quietly, "everyone will think I've finally moved on. That I've forgotten her. Forgotten what I did. Or, James said gently, they'll think you've finally forgiven yourself, which is different from forgetting. The prince's shoulders shook. He pressed harder against the doors as if trying to draw strength from them. Or say goodbye. Will you help me? He asked, his voice barely audible. Tomorrow. Will you be here when they're removed? James stood. Of course, sir. I can't do it alone. I need... The prince turned, and his face was raw with emotion. I need someone who understands. Someone who doesn't judge. I'll be here, sir. The prince nodded. Then, suddenly, he pulled James into an embrace. It was brief, awkward, completely against protocol, but real. When he pulled away, he was crying again. But differently this time. Not with despair. With something that looked almost like relief. Asterisk, the next morning arrived with gray skies and cold rain. James stood in the hallway outside the gallery at dawn. The same spot where he'd stood 7 months ago, but everything felt different now. The prince arrived at 7. He looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were redrimmed, his movements slow. But there was something else in his face too. Determination. Resolution. She stayed, he said quietly. My wife. She was awake when I got back last night. I told her everything. About the guilt. About why I couldn't let go. And I told her that today, with her permission, the portraits would be removed. What did she say, sir? The prince's eyes grew bright. She cried, and then she said, I don't need you to forget her. I just need you to choose me. Choose us. Choose the life we're trying to build. He paused. So that's what I'm doing. He pulled out a key and unlocked the gallery doors. They swung open slowly, and James saw inside for the first time in months. The portraits were there. 3 of them. Diana, in different stages of her life, young and radiant in one, elegant and confident in another, and in the third, softer somehow, sadder, like she knew what was coming. The prince walked to each one slowly, stood before them. His hands were clasped behind his back, trembling. I'm sorry, he whispered. For everything, for the pain I caused, for not being brave enough to love you properly, for all the years you suffered because of my cowardice. His voice broke, but he kept going. I can't undo it. I can't make it right. But I can stop letting guilt destroy everything else in my life. I can try to be better. To honor your memory by being the man I should have been. James stood silent in the doorway, witnessing something private and profound. The prince touched each portrait gently, his fingers tracing the frames. Then he turned to James. Where should they go? Somewhere private, sir. Somewhere you can visit when you need to, but not somewhere that makes them a shrine. Not somewhere that keeps you trapped. The prince nodded. My private study. There's a wall there. Small, quiet. Would that be appropriate? I think that would be perfect, sir. The removal crew arrived at 8. Gerald the decorator was there too, looking nervous. The same man who'd been with the Duchess 7 months ago. He recognized James immediately, his eyes widening. Mr. Whitmore, he said cautiously. Gerald. James nodded. They worked carefully, reverently. The prince supervised every moment, making sure each portrait was wrapped properly, handled with care. It took nearly 2 hours. When the walls were finally bare, the prince stood in the empty gallery for a long time. The space looked wrong without them, naked, like something essential had been removed. But he didn't cry. He just breathed deeply, turned, and walked out. Thank you, Whitmore, he said. For last night? For today. For understanding, of course, sir. Prince started to leave, then paused. I heard you're on the outer grounds now. How is it? Quiet, sir. Peaceful. Would you consider returning to interior duty? I could arrange it. You've earned it. James thought about it. About the politics, the tension, the impossible choices. Then he thought about his wife's relief when he'd been reassigned. Her smile when he came home each night, without the weight of palace intrigue on his shoulders. Thank you, sir. But I think I'm where I need to be. The prince smiled sadly. Perhaps we both are now. He left, and the crew finished their work. By noon, the gallery was being repainted. Fresh white walls. Clean. New James walked through the palace one last time before leaving. He passed staff members who nodded respectfully, past the corridor where the Duchess's new office was located. Through the window, he could see her at her desk, working. She looked up as he passed. Their eyes met for just a moment. She didn't smile, but she nodded slightly. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or understanding. James nodded back. Outside, the rain had stopped. Weak sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. James walked to his car, but something made him pause and look back at the building, at the windows, at the history and heartbreak contained within those ancient walls. He thought about Diana, about the prince, about the Duchess, about all the people trapped by love and guilt and impossible choices. And he thought about that morning 7 months ago, when he'd refused to move, when he'd chosen loyalty over obedience, when he'd understood, somehow, that grief needs protection sometimes, that people need time, even when others think that time has run out. He'd been right to stand his ground that day, but the prince had been right to let go today. Both things could be true. Both things were necessary. James climbed into his car and drove home. Where his wife was waiting with lunch and questions she wouldn't ask, he'd tell her eventually. About the call. About the gallery. About watching a prince choose his future over his past. But for now, he just held her hand across the table and felt grateful for the simple truth of love without ghosts. Without guilt. Without regret. It was a gift. One the prince was only just learning to receive. 2 years passed. James rarely thought about that day anymore. Life on the outer grounds was peaceful, predictable. He watched tourists gather at the gates, took his breaks in the garden, and went home each evening to dinner and quiet conversation. But sometimes, late at night, he'd take out the card the prince had given him. The one with the private number? He'd never called it. Never needed to. But he kept it in his wallet, a reminder of the day he'd stood between a prince and his grief. Then, one morning in spring, James received an official letter. Royal seal. Heavy paper. His wife watched nervously as he opened it. Inside was an invitation. The prince and duchess were hosting a private ceremony, a small gathering to honor palace staff who'd shown exceptional service. James's name was on the list. You should go, his wife said, though her voice was uncertain. I don't know if I should, James replied. It's been so long. Maybe it's better to leave things in the past. But curiosity won. And perhaps something else, too. A need to know how the story had ended. The ceremony was held in one of the smaller palace halls. Only about 30 people attended. Staff members mostly. A few advisors. James recognized some faces, including Robert Pemberton, who nodded at him with something that looked like respect. The prince and duchess entered together. She looked different than James remembered. Softer somehow. More at ease. And the prince, he looked lighter. The shadows under his eyes were gone. His smile reached his face in a way it hadn't before. They gave short speeches, thanking various staff members for their service. Names were called. Commendations given. Polite applause after each one. Then the prince paused. Looked directly at James. There's one more person I'd like to recognize today. Someone who taught me an important lesson about loyalty, about grief, and about knowing when to hold on and when to let go. James felt his face flush as everyone turned to look at him. James Whitmore served the royal family for 25 years. During that time, he demonstrated not just duty, but understanding. Not just obedience, but wisdom. The prince's voice grew quieter. 2 years ago, he stood his ground when it would have been easier to step aside. And 7 months later, he stood beside me when I needed to make the hardest choice of my life. The Duchess was watching her husband, and James saw something remarkable in her face. Gratitude. She knew. She understood what James had done both times and why it mattered. Mr. Whitmore, the prince continued, your service represents the best of what loyalty can be. Not blind obedience, but thoughtful conviction. Not just following orders, but understanding the heart behind them. He walked forward and presented James with a medal. Small, simple, but bearing the royal crest. "Thank you," the prince said quietly, so only James could hear. "For everything." James accepted the medal with shaking hands. "It was my honor, sir." After the ceremony, as guests mingled over tea and small cakes, the Duchess approached James. He stood immediately uncertain. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Her voice was warm, genuine. "I never properly thanked you." You gave him time," she interrupted gently. "That day, when you refused to let me into the gallery, I was so angry. I thought you were defying me out of loyalty to a ghost. But you weren't, were you?" James chose his words carefully. "I was following orders, ma'am." "Yes. But you were also giving my husband what he needed. Time to grieve. Time to process. Time to be ready." She smiled, and it was sad but real. "If you'd let me in that day, if those portraits had been removed when I wanted, I think he would have resented me forever. The grief would have just gone underground, festered, destroyed us." She paused, looking across the room to where the prince was talking with staff members, laughing at something someone said. Instead, he had time. And when he was finally ready, it was his choice. His decision. And that made all the difference. She turned back to James. "So thank you. For understanding what I couldn't see. For protecting something that needed protection, even from me." James felt his throat tighten. "You're very gracious, ma'am. Very lucky," she corrected. "We both are. He's a different man now, present, here, with me." Her eyes grew bright. "We're expecting a child, actually. Just found out last week. That's wonderful, ma'am. Congratulations. It is wonderful. And it's possible because he was able to let go of the past, to forgive himself, to choose the future. You helped give us that future, Mr. Whitmore. Never think otherwise." She squeezed his arm gently and walked away, rejoining her husband. The prince put his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him. Easy, natural, no ghosts between them. James watched them for a moment, then felt someone beside him. Robert Pemberton, holding a teacup, looking thoughtful. "You're right," Pemberton said without preamble. "That day, you were right to stand your ground. I was just following orders, sir." Pemberton made a sound that might have been a laugh. "We both know it was more than that. You understood something the rest of us missed, that grief has its own timeline, that you can't rush healing." "Perhaps," James agreed. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the prince and duchess, watching the future unfold in a room full of people who'd served the past. "Do you ever wonder," Pemberton asked quietly, "what would have happened if you'd let her in that day? If you'd just opened the doors and stepped aside?" James thought about it. About the prince sitting on the floor, broken. About the duchess packing her bags. About all the pain that might have come from forcing the issue too soon. "I try not to wonder about alternative paths, sir. We can only walk the one we're on." Pemberton nodded. "Wise words, though I suppose that's why you're the one with the medal." James left the palace that afternoon feeling lighter than he had in years. The story had ended well. The prince had found peace. The duchess had found her place. And James had played his small part in a drama much larger than himself. At home, he showed his wife the medal. She held it carefully, her eyes shining with pride. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me what really happened." All of it. So he did. He told her about the morning he'd refused to move. About the night the prince had called him. About watching the portraits come down. About the ceremony, and the duchess's gratitude, and the child that was coming. He told her everything. And she listened, and when he was finished, she took his hand. "You did the right thing," she said simply. "Not the easy thing." "The right thing, both times?" James asked. "Both times." That night, James took the card with the prince's private number and finally threw it away. He didn't need it anymore. That chapter was closed. The story was finished. But sometimes, late at night, he'd take out the medal. He'd hold it and remember. Remember what it felt like to stand between a man and his grief. To protect something invisible, but essential. to know when to hold firm and when to step aside. He'd remember the portraits on the wall, Diana's face in 3 different moments, and he'd remember the prince's face when those portraits finally came down. Pain and relief mixed together, ending and beginning in the same breath. James had spent 25 years serving the royal family. But those 2 days, the day he refused to move and the day he helped them let go, those were the days that defined his service. Because real loyalty isn't just about following orders. It's about understanding the person behind the orders, their pain, their struggle, their need for time and grace and space to heal. And sometimes the most loyal thing you can do is stand your ground. Refuse to move. Protect what's precious even when everyone else wants to rush forward, until the moment comes when moving forward is the loyal thing. When letting go becomes the greatest service. James had done both, and in doing so, he'd helped write the ending to a story of grief, guilt, and grace. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.